Hey, today I have a tutorial for you about infantry, and it was based on a question that was brought up in the comments for one of my videos, which was how much, I think it said something like, you often talk about that a list may have too little infantry, so how much is enough? And that is what I'll talk about today. So how much infantry do you really need in Bold Action version 3? The caveats for this is that it's still early days. We don't know yet. We only have a few tournaments that I know of, and I've seen the data for. So it's very early days, but we have some wisdom from V2. We have some experience, or I have some experience with the game so far, with what I think is approximately where we're going to land. And this has the caveats of being hugely meta dependent. So if you have open tables, you're going to need a lot more infantry because your infantry is going to die. If you have closed tables, then your infantry is going to live, and that changes up everything. So the terrain meta is really important, as is the meta for what army types you build as well. So all of that, huge caveats still. What forms does the infantry come in? That's the first thing I want to address when I'm talking about this topic. For me, the infantry are units that can go and grab objectives. That's mainly what we use infantry for in V3, because everything else can do other stuff, kill stuff or move off the table and be points in that way. But infantry is more or less the only thing that can move up and grab objectives. And it comes in two forms. It comes in blocks of infantry sections, the thing you choose in your infantry selection for your rifle platoon or what have you, which is typically between 4 and 20 guys in a section. Most of them will have rifles, at least when you initially buy them in your app, or when you build your army list. And you can then upgrade some of them with LMGs, SMGs, or maybe you get access to special weapons, a grenade launcher or something. And you get them in inexperienced, regular, or veteran. Now I'll get back to what I'm seeing mostly being used later on, but that's just the basis of what infantry sections are, right? So they are large blocks of infantry. These are typically the ones that you can send up and expect to survive some punishment. The other thing that you can do is sneaky infantry teams, which is 1 to 3 men in a small group of infantry. They can be officers or they can be special weapons. It doesn't really matter what it is that they are, but they have the same function of being a small infantry unit that you can maybe sneak up and grab the odd objective, right? They're not going to be units that can push other infantry or other units off objectives or really damage other infantry and other units, but they can deliver pins and they can sneakily take objectives or push into breakthrough zones or what have you. These also come mostly equipped right now before the army books come out. They are equipped as models, which means that most of us have SMGs on officers at least. And then there are a lot of special weapons. So the AT rifle, the light mortar, that's infantry teams. Now, these are quite often bought according to what you want them to do and not whether you want them to survive or not. So if you're, for instance, like me, buying inexperienced light mortars, it's because you're not that bothered about them being squishy, because they are squishy, right? Even if I got them veteran, they would be squishy. They would die easily. And I don't have the detriment of the -1 to hit. But I buy AT rifles, always regular. Why? Because that's the cheapest regular one I can get, or the cheapest one I can get without getting the -1 to hit. And I'm not bothered about going veteran because that extra survivability is not what infantry teams are for me, and a lot of other competitive players, by the way. We have had 2 tournaments that has told us something about the amount of infantry that you need. And the first one was World Open War. And yes, I know World Open War wasn't a clear-cut V3 tournament. But it did have a lot of the elements that we're seeing in V3. It had expanded army lists and such. So it wasn't a clear-cut V3 tournament. But if we look at the top 3 teams, so I've looked at Poland, Spain, and Germany. Again, these 3 teams, they did really well, all of them, and ended up in the top bracket. If we look at their lists, each single list in those 3 teams, so that's 12 lists, sorry, no, not 12, 9 lists, they had between 4 and 8 infantry sections. So 4 is the absolute minimum infantry sections they had. They had between 3 and 10 teams, infantry teams. Again, the low end here is mostly officers, but the high end is someone investing in a lot of these small units. And all of them had above 33 bodies, so infantry men in their combined infantry sections and teams. The highest number that we had was 63, and that was an inexperienced horde. That was Manuel, the German team captain. So 63, so between 34 and 63. The average number of infantrymen, of boots on the ground, was 44 bodies at 1100 points. Because the points, of course, does also change up what you can and should do, right? If you have more infantry bodies, the higher you go in points. So that's one tournament where we can look at what do we think did well, and you can sort of see that none of these are anemic in their body count. They have fairly high. 34 bodies is an okay amount, and 63 is an insane amount of bodies. Then we had the tournament in Santiago, Chile, which I also studied quite closely. And in that one, we had a spread of the top 5 people. The people who came top 5, they had between 3 and 4 infantry sections and 3 and 12 teams. So there was a lot more small teams here doing the work of sneaking up and grabbing objectives. And they had between 33 bodies and 53 bodies. So a little lower, but that is also because Santiago was 1,000 point and not 1,100. It had 41 bodies on average, the top 5 lists. So we can see that what we're aiming for, I think, with most lists is if you're going for 1,000 to 1,100 points, you should have above 40 men in your list, 40 boots, infantry bodies in your list, and you should have somewhere like +3+ infantry sections, right? So that's my hunch. My hunch is that you need 3 to 4 good infantry units, infantry sections. You need 4 to 8 teams, depending on your build. At least 30+ bodies of regulars or veterans, and if you're going to go Inex, you need at least 40+ to do that. And your mileage may, of course, vary immensely depending on your army build. If you have a gun line, this may not be what you need to put in it. If you have a lot of armor, it may not be how you need to build it. But that is at least what we're seeing from the people who win tournaments, that they have more than 30 men, more than 40 if they're inexperienced, and they have 3 to 4 good infantry units and 4+, maybe even 12 teams, depending, right? So what is the factors that is influencing this number? Well, it's 2 factors. One is that in V3 enemy action, the fire that your infantry is taking is a lot more dangerous, and that's one of the things that is sort of messing up my calculation for how much infantry do we really need in a platoon, because you're taking fire from turn 1. You didn't used to do that in version 2. That would be turn 3 maybe that you started taking fire, which means that I think potentially we need to up the amount of infantry that we have if the infantry is going to survive and do something in our games. You are also taking a lot more fire from armor, which it's difficult to influence, and bombardment is also something that is going to happen a lot more because there's a lot more artillery pieces, there's a lot more artillery and air observers, and all of that is just pounding into your infantry. So infantry is much less survivable in V3, which is a problem for us running infantry. There's also the fact that you're going to need to maneuver, because what the infantry does is that they push up and take objectives. And they are not only in danger because they're moving up into the center of the board where more things can see them, so the enemy action, but also they're in danger of being charged by dedicated assaulters, Polish Lancers and Gurkhas, or by being point blank shot with submachine guns by an enemy veteran unit that came out of a truck somewhere, right? And just obliterated off the table. So the infantry is a lot more vulnerable, and that's why I think that we're going to see changes in the size of the units and in the composition of the units. And these changes are not done yet. The meta hasn't settled yet and told us what is optimized for our game. The old wisdom, though, is that with inexperienced orderized spam, you take the minimum sized units with no upgrades, and then you're just spamming out orders. You don't care if that unit dies then, because you got 15 more. These units should cost around 35 points a pop, which is pretty cheap, and for 12.50 you can get a lot of those in your list, right? So that makes the infantry choices sort of into teams. It's sort of in the same, because they're very vulnerable and very squishy. And you take 5 so that you need so that the enemy will have to kill 3 before you take the test to run away, right? Always take odd numbers unless you're Finnish. Teams, for me, that is simply cutting the cost down to make the teams as cheap as possible, because even though you're just paying 21 points for an officer, that officer can take objectives. So it's make them as cheap as possible and still be maybe effective if they have a special weapon that they need to fire at not -1, right? But cutting the cost down for me, for teams, because they're much more squishy than the infantry, and infantry is already very, very squishy. Then you have units that are backline holders. That is infantry. Typically there'll be 5 dudes, maybe 6. Often they'll be regulars because they need to shoot. And they'll be equipped with rifles and then maybe an LMG or 2, depending on composition and stuff. That unit is still good because it can sit in the back line, it can go at ambush, and if something shoots at you, you go down, you're very likely to survive then. Horde units was a thing that happened a lot in V2, but less so in V3, and I'm not sure if they're coming back at all. But they were inexperienced units of 10 plus dudes that typically just overwhelmed the enemy with bodies that they had to shoot down. So that there were simply too many men to kill them all, or they overwhelmed you in close combat. That is less successful now, much less successful. So the Horde is having a difficult time. I'm not sure it's out for the count. I know there's a lot of very good players who are Horde players who are working on this, but right now it's slightly parked to the side. As is the Flamer delivery, because the Flamers have been nerfed quite heavily in version 3, but the old wisdom was that you ran Flamers, 5-man, regulars because they need to be cheap, veterans if you needed them to survive after they had delivered the Flamer, and you gave them a truck or something to transport them. That was the barbecue stable of most barbecue lists, that you had that flamer push, right? And then you had the push units, which was 7 to 8 veterans with SMGs or with body armor or even with flamers or with special rules like the Gurkhas that gave them close combat bonuses. These units are still really good, but they are a lot more exposed to incoming fire, so that is also changing up how much they are used still. So that is my reflections right now on infantry and how much is enough. Thank you, Juan Pablo, who is sort of initiated this debate with his list, because he had a list that had very little infantry. He had 28 infantry bodies, which clearly I've shown to you is not what people are winning with. So too little infantry, too weak, and that was Juan Pablo's own comment as well. And thank you, Comster, for the comment that initiated this little debate here. That was it from me today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Cheers.